Now it seems the world's leading COVID-19 vaccine developers are just weeks away from crossing the finish line, with governments planning to start vaccinating their citizens before Christmas in some countries. AstraZeneca announced Monday that its viral vector-based vaccine has a 70% chance of making people immune to COVID-19. The effectiveness rose to 90% in another regime, close to the near 95% efficacy rates of other vaccine frontrunners Pfizer and Moderna, who have applied to the US Food and Drug Administration for emergency authorization. As these companies race to quickly save and protect lives against the devastating pandemic, governments around the world are now working to procure and distribute the doses as quickly and as efficiently as possible. To discuss their efforts, the challenges they face, and the questions we have as members of the public, we connect with Dr. Albert Ko, Professor of Epidemiology and Medicine at Yale School of Public Health. It's lovely to have you back on our show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Soo-young. And thank you for the kind invitation.
Well, let's go straight into the questions. So AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford said Monday very exciting news that their vaccine has shown a high effectiveness of around 70% and 90% in another regime. But that is lower, though, compared to the mRNA vaccines developed by Pfizer and Moderna. Does that mean then we should all try and get the mRNA shots? I mean, how promising is this British vaccine?
Well, so a couple of things. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, trial, which gave its preliminary results today, actually showed that in combined analysis, there's about 70% protection. But as you mentioned, Soo-young, there's really one very important point that was to be made. When they looked at two different dosing schemes, one was about 90% effective, the other was 62% effective. And that higher dosing scheme really, it's about the same efficacy that's been found with the mRNA vaccines that are produced by Moderna and Pfizer. So really the differences between those, the efficacy of these three vaccine candidates are actually not very large.
Well, what advantages do you think the AstraZeneca vaccine would have over the mRNA ones?
Right. So the major advantage is one is that they could scale up production, to produce large numbers of doses, and also to produce doses and which will facilitate their use, particularly in many parts of the world, and not only in the richest countries, but also in the poorest countries. The AstraZeneca vaccine is actually stable in the regular refrigerated temperatures for up to 6 months, and that greatly facilitates the ability to roll up on a mass scale its use in poorest countries, whether it be in Africa, parts of Asia, or in the Americas.
And the AstraZeneca one seems much more affordable as well, priced at around $4 compared to Moderna and Pfizer's pricing of over $30, I believe. And so I suppose AstraZeneca does have various advantages over Pfizer and Moderna. But those two companies, though, Pfizer and Moderna, they've both requested emergency authorization, reporting a near 95% efficacy. How accurate are interim results? And what would the authorities then have to review before actually making the decision?
And Soo-young, I just want to, I think going back to your first point about the lower cost for AstraZeneca, that's very important. And that's important when we're thinking about rolling out a vaccine that's going to leave no one behind, that's going to give a broad public health benefit. And that's also important because AstraZeneca, has also promised that they would provide the vaccine at cost for the poorest countries or lower middle income countries. And so there are a lot of advantages with the pricing, not only the pricing scheme, but also the distribution scheme. In terms of, the EUA authorization and what it really takes, whether it's the Pfizer, Moderna, or the AstraZeneca vaccine, there are really two major criteria. One, which, is based on their, interim analyses, and for the Pfizer vaccine, for the final analyses, as well as for the AstraZeneca, they all will reach the benchmark of having greater than 50% efficacy with efficacy, estimates of 95%. That's far above that expectation. The other major criteria is safety, and that these vaccines don't have increased safety signals or adverse events after up to 2 months after vaccination. And based on the final results from the Pfizer vaccine, as also with the AstraZeneca, it appears that they've reached that criteria for emergency use authorization.
But there's still quite a lot of skepticism surrounding vaccines, though. I mean, given the pace of just the speed at which they were developed, quite historic, really, when you consider that they just developed this within less than a year, really. And many people are saying that they aren't going to get the vaccine even when it's available. So then what kinds of measures do you think are going to have to be in place after people get injected with a new kind of vaccine to actually ensure that it's safe? I mean, will there be extra scrutiny for mRNA types in particular?
Yeah, so Young, that's a very important point. We have problems with vaccine hesitancy. Whether for effective vaccines like the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine or other childhood vaccines. And so overcoming the vaccine hesitancy is going to be very important. And the best way to do that is by instilling trust as well as trustworthiness in the process of demonstrating safety and effectiveness. So these vaccines, as you mentioned, have been ramped up very quickly because of the public health emergency of international concern or global concern. Then there's a second important step. And as I mentioned, for the emergency use authorization, it's important to maximize the impact of these vaccines. And so they've sped up and they've done a 2-month, look at adverse, of any safety signals or adverse events. That needs to be extended in what we call post-licensure surveillance. So that has two major goals. One is to show that we have long-term or longer duration of effectiveness of this vaccine over time, that the vaccine only doesn't work for 1 or 2 months after immunization, but for a longer period. And the second is to make sure that, and to reassure the public that there are no adverse events or safety signals that are worrisome for this. And these are all being set up now that these first set of trials have been done.
And really, why was it possible, though, to develop an mRNA vaccine faster than the more traditional vector-based ones that we're used to? And as a scientist, I mean, what do you think this means for this progress in mRNA vaccines mean for the future of vaccination?
So surely this is a unprecedented scientific leap, not only a public health success story, but in what we hope to be a major public health success story, but also a scientific leap. So the old way of making vaccines was that you had to identify, for example, the genome or the part of the virus that is important for making a robust immune response. You have to insert that in or clone that into a vector virus, such as the AstraZeneca. It's a chimpanzee adenovirus, which is a weak virus that doesn't cause disease in humans. And that whole process takes time. The advantage of the mRNA is that once they got the genome sequence from the epidemic in Wuhan back in January, they knew that genetic code, and they were able to synthesize that very quickly using standard chemical processes, and actually make large amounts of that could go rapidly into trials and to be tested as soon as May and June of this year. So that technology has enabled us to accelerate that. I think that also forebodes good a potentially important way of addressing future pandemics and future emerging infectious diseases that may come in the future, in accelerating the process of going from development to evaluation in clinical trials.
Well, your government is planning to vaccinate the first Americans, I suppose, with the COVID-19 vaccine as early as December 11th, and the UK perhaps even sooner than that. But the question is, are hospitals, though, are they ready to distribute the vaccine, especially an mRNA one? I mean, what are the challenges there?
So obviously the challenges of disseminating, or the logistics of distributing a vaccine, such as that requires ultra deep, temperatures, ultra deep freezers with minus 80 degrees Celsius is a bit large undertaking. One of the big, so this is something that has been through Operation Warp Speed, which is a special initiative that was launched by the United States, back in the summer to accelerate that process. And part of that is getting not only the logistics of the networks of where the vaccines could be stored, but also getting it to places. This vaccine is not only going to be, distributed and disseminated by hospitals, but also in pharmacies and also in private practice offices. And that's a huge undertaking. When we think about it, at least in the United States, we have had very few mass vaccination campaigns. Actually, we've had none in the last half century, where we've done large, mass vaccinations. So there's a lot of steep learning curve that has to be done. But that said, in the state that I would live in Connecticut, our hospitals are ramping up so that we can start immunizing healthcare workers, by the end of the year.
And once the vaccines start being rolled out, obviously not everyone's going to have access to them straight away. So how do you think governments should make best use of the limited supplies in the initial stages?
Yeah, so I think there are several criteria. And here in the United States, our National Academy of Sciences have come out with very sound criteria. These are being adopted by our CDC, but it's really based on maximizing the benefit of this public health, potential public health success story. And that's one by prioritizing groups that have the highest risk of being infected, those who are also having the highest risk of possibly transmitting the disease. As you know, in the United States, we've had a large crippling or devastating epidemic in our nursing homes. So vaccinating staff who work in nursing homes will be key so that they can block the transmission to susceptible elderly patients in these nursing home environments. And then the third is really, protecting those who have the highest risk of severe outcomes and severe complications from COVID. And that's many times our elderly population. But we also have to think about vulnerability when we think about the response to COVID. Throughout the world, many times our poorest, most vulnerable communities are the ones that have actually had the highest burden and suffered the greatest effects of COVID. So the issue of social justice and equity, of course, is intrinsic in maximizing the benefit of this vaccine.
And of course, the question everyone's been asking, when will this all end, and when can we go back to normal? So if all goes to plan, then around 70% of the population are vaccinated by May in your country, and maybe some other deadlines for other countries. Does that mean that the virus, for the most part, will stop spreading? And can we finally then return to our normal pre-pandemic lives?
So first of all, developing an effective vaccine has been an incredible success and a victory. But that's just the first step in many. In getting this vaccine out to people, and you mentioned before, Young, about the problem of vaccine hesitancy, making sure that everyone can benefit from this is going to be a major challenge, getting the vaccine out to people. But the question about when we can get back to our normal pre-pandemic lives, at this point, we really don't know. And I think there's one big question, a big scientific question that needs to be answered. We know these vaccines can prevent disease based on the studies from the Pfizer, Moderna, and the AstraZeneca study. But the big question is whether they can prevent infection and they can block transmission. So if I get vaccinated, will it prevent me from getting infected? Or if it doesn't prevent me from getting infected, will it prevent me from transmitting to somebody else? And that's very important when you're thinking about that 70% threshold that many people are talking about, herd immunity. a vaccine, in order to help get to what we call the threshold of herd immunity, that 70%, is going to have to be a vaccine that reduces transmission of one person to another in order to get back to this new normal, in order to block transmission and spreading.
So there's still some lingering questions there. I mean, we're going to have to wait and see and still keep the safety precautions very much in place until things are pretty much confirmed. But, well, then you mentioned before social justice and ensuring that there's access to vaccines all around the world, especially in the most vulnerable communities. Well, there is the need to store vaccines like the ones developed by Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna, of course, to under 70 degrees Celsius with the required cold chain infrastructure. And that really puts it out of reach for up to 2/3 of the world's population. And there is the COVAX alliance, of course, an alliance of 186 countries to ensure that middle and low-income economies won't be left behind. But there is a huge funding gap. The G20 over the weekend pledged efforts, but no concrete measures to ensure affordable and universal access to a COVID-19 vaccine. So in addition to actually offering money, financial support, which they really need, in what other ways should developing countries receive support from very rich governments?
Well, so I think this is the critical issue that we're going to be facing in the next year. Again, how do we maximize this output, or this public health tool, new public health tool that we have for the benefit of public health throughout the world? And we also know that if we don't control it in one part of the world, given the transmissibility of this vaccine, it can always spread, become a foci for spread to places that have been vaccinated and maybe not haven't completely vaccinated or entirely vaccinated their population. So there are several mechanisms. I think one of the most important ones, and one that I think all of us in public health are looking towards, is really strengthening again the multilateral bond through the WHO, so that we can have not fragmented vaccine initiatives across regions and countries, but we can have a strategic, unified, integrated plan that allows not only the richest countries, but the poorest countries. And I think the leadership of WHO is very much needed in this moment. The second part is that, of course, there have been, very important initiatives. I think AstraZeneca with, promising that they will supply 44% of all doses to lower middle income countries at cost. That's surely a major step. Getting the funding mechanisms, the finance, chain involved in order to provide those vaccines at cost are going to be important. There's certainly other initiatives, and in decentralizing vaccine production is going to be critical. There are Serum Institute in India, Butantan Institute, as well as Biomanguinhos in Brazil, are examples of countries, developing countries, that are investing in their own vaccine production to provide capacity not only for their own countries but for the region. So this requires, of course, a lot of leveraging, financial leveraging, and there's a lot of risk involved. So really having the financial institutions and the companies, the countries, whether it's the G20 or so forth, providing that mitigation, the risk mitigation in scaling up and decentralizing vaccine production is going to be key to understanding whether we're going to get back to that new normal, globally in the next year or two.
Right, so as you mentioned, various ways that we can really help developing countries, lower income countries, really localize production and make sure that the vaccine reaches other regional players as well. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to end the discussion here, but thank you so much for your insights. That was Dr. Albert Ko, Professor of Epidemiology and Medicine at the Yale School of Public Health. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Sue Young.
And to our viewers, thank you as always for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow here in South Korea. Don't miss our show then. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.